One thing is I had this pretty high in the vise for when I was marking it out because it's up a little bit higher, a little bit easier to do, but now I'm gonna lower that back down and get to cutting. So like anything else, you know, you just want to start lightly and go from there. So your main critical portion is how square this is across the end. Because if this isn't square, then you may run into issues down the line. Not quite as critical with half blinds, but if you don't cut this square, it'll probably be noticeable through dovetails, because this is something that you'll see. Not quite as critical, since these are half blind, so you won't actually see this line, but it does help to avoid any gaps and anything like that, especially when you're transferring these tails to the pins. And then the other thing is, this side isn't as important because it'll be on the inside, but on this side, make sure you don't go past that line, because then you'll see it once it's completed that you've cut too far. So just keep that in mind. Take your time, go slow. You know, it's not a race. If you were trying to do these as fast as you could, honestly, probably set something else up anyway. So here we go. Alright, and then I like to use a fret saw, and I've turned the blade a little bit, so this is actually cutting straight horizontally. And the reason for that is if I got here, I'd only be able to get partway through that middle pin before I'd have to turn around and come back. So I just do it this way because I'm used to cutting that way, and so that's why I have this twisted. But now what I'm going to do is cut slightly away from my line, so I can come back later with a chisel and clean it up. All right, now we go ahead and cut these ends off. So the next thing I'll do is clean up these insides here. Should be good to go. Awesome. Okay, so now what I have is my workpiece here set up in the vise along with this piece, which is set up to be the same height. So I'll move that back. And then the next thing I would do is take this pin board that I had, or this tail board, put it on the pin board. And since we cut that rabbet before, you can kind of slide this right up to it, and that gives you a perfect line for where you needed to be. So I just take a scrap, put it up in the edge here so I can get that lined up perfectly. Grab your marking knife, and then you can mark out these tails onto your pin board. Oh, I should also mention that I took the marking gauge that was set for that rabbet and I ran it across the edge lightly just to get the line that these tails ended up being. Otherwise, you could also, if you wanted to, mark those out from the end here as well. So now I'm just marking out all these tails. Some people prefer to use a pencil, some people prefer to use a knife. I actually prefer, to be honest, using a pencil or a pen. Pencil probably. Just because I find it a little bit easier to cut to a pencil line than to a knife line. But at the same time, these pins aren't very wide, so trying to get the pencil in there and to a point where I can get that pencil to make those lines, just it doesn't always work for me, so I just go with the marking knife instead. And then once I do that, I'll just go in, for clarity's sake, mark out with pencil where those knife lines were. And we're working with pine, at least I'm working with pine, so it's pretty compressible as far as wood for dovetails goes. So if you're a little bit off and you cut a little bit undersized, it's not the end of the world. Just be careful that you don't split out the ends, because that would definitely suck, having gotten this far. All right, so next thing. Now that I've marked those top tails onto it, I'm going to grab my little square here, and I'm going to again put my knife in the knife mark that I've already made, slide up the square to it, and then just mark a knife line down. And this will be something else to follow when you're cutting the waist out as much as you can with a dovetail saw, just because otherwise you can end up where you have to try and eyeball vertical while also cutting off to the side. And there's enough things already going on here that it's one of those sorts of deals where it's like, well, why make it any harder for yourself than you have to? So I just like to mark out the verticals. If you're well practiced enough at this, I'm sure you don't need to, but I'm not, so I do. And again with pencil. And I should also mention that these knife lines, I mean, you could also just do this part in pencil, because really you don't necessarily need to cut to it, you just need to cut parallel to it. That is to say, you don't have to cut this line. You just need to make sure that wherever you do cut, it's perfectly vertical. Otherwise, things will be out of whack. So that's the only reason why I mark them just because for me it's a lot easier to follow it when I'm following something specific and not just trying to imagine a straight line. All right, so this is the part I think that's probably one of the trickiest. Basically, you need to follow both this line, that line, make sure you don't cross this one, and make sure you don't cross that one. However, if you're going to cross one, cross this one, not that one. This one you'll see, this one you might not. You do have a little bit of leeway since we cut that rabbit. You have that depth of rabbit here where if you cut below it, you're not going to be in trouble because you'll still be able to see it. But if you go too far, you'll definitely see it. And why not try to be accurate whenever you can? Being invaded. Hi, Chester. What? What? Apparently he doesn't want to help. All right. So again, remember, just inside that knife line if you can. Now there's kind of two schools of thought to this. One is that you cut close and pare down to your line, and the other is you just go for it and cut it close and be on the money. I aim for on the money, but usually shy away just in case, which is usually good because for some reason I think I'm further away than I am usually. And I also like to cut all of the same direction first and then go the other side and go the other direction, just because to me there's a little bit of muscle memory with it that once you do the first one or two, it's a lot easier to just keep doing those same cuts instead of switching back and forth each time. So that's why I went one direction and now I'm coming back. All right, so there's that. Now, you remember I had that knife. This knife. And I also have a softer face mallet, and be careful on this part. If you're not comfortable or if you're making this part particularly thin, this half pin, which technically is bigger than my normal pins, but that's beside the point, you might want to put a clamp across the ends just to make sure you don't split it. However, this being pine and then a bigger half pin here, I'm actually not that worried about it. I've done a couple of them, but go slow. You basically put this in here and you start tapping on it. And pretty much just pound it down until you sever the fibers that are in there. Because obviously if we're cutting like this, at this angle, well, that leaves all this wood here that hasn't been cut. So either we go in there and cut that somehow. In this case, I'm using a knife. I've also seen videos use like a card scraper, a thicker card scraper. They just pounded that in there. They had sharpened that a little bit. I've also seen they took an old back saw, I think it was a gent saw, they filed off the teeth and they used that, but I just use the utility knife because I have it and it works well enough for me. And if I need a new blade, I can just replace it instead of having to try and sharpen it. So basically all we're looking to do is sever those fibers. To make it a lot easier for once we go back in there to chop out all the waste. Okay, so that should be that. Next thing to do is clear out the waste. So you could, if you were so inclined, go ahead and chop out all this waste. Basically you cross cut with the chisel across this face, you come in from the end and split that out, you keep going until you basically hit your lines. Or if you have a drill press or another drill, I've even done it with just a bit brace before with a Forstner bit in it. You can also drill out the waste, or the majority of the waste, which is what I'm going to do because, well, maybe it's because I just got this drill press, so I'm kind of excited to use it. But the other reason is because it is fairly quick to just drill this out instead of going back and forth, keep chopping all of it out. So I'm going to drill it, and I've set a depth stop on my drill press so it'll only go to a certain level. And make sure that when you set that, it goes so that you don't go down all the way past your line. I actually have it set so that the spur just barely gets to about the right depth, and that leaves me about 1/8 of an inch, maybe a little bit less, 3/32 of an inch of space, or of wood that I still need to chop out. So that's what I'm going to do now, and I will catch you back when I'm inside. All right, now that I've drilled out the waste, or if you've chopped out a decent portion of it, now I'm going to grab my chisel and start cleaning this out a little bit. I'm not chopping on my line yet. I'm chopping close to my line. Then you might want to take your smaller chisel here at a little bit of an angle and just sever a little bit more of that side section that we couldn't really get with the bigger chisel. If you also have skew or dovetail chisels, this is a good time to use them, and if you don't, it's a good excuse to buy them. Though I will note, I don't have any. Kind of wish I did, but I don't. Alright, now we will come in here and just pop out a little bit more of that waste in the side that we couldn't really get to with the drill press. Alright, so now we should have a good majority of that cleaned out with a little bit of extra here. You can see I have almost 1/8 of an inch left, and first thing I'm going to do is actually clear out this baseline a little bit better. So now that I've chopped close to it, I can put my chisel right in that knife line and go straight down. Once you've done that, give it a couple of decent wallops. And this will be what we do to get started to clean out the end here a little bit. And I'm not going directly into that knife line yet, just like before with the other side. I don't want to go in quite aggressively enough to take out that much wood yet, just because it may not split the way we want it to. So I'm actually going to be coming back with my router plane and cleaning this up a little bit better. Alright, so I've got my router plane, and I will go ahead and clean up the bottom here. So now that we've cleaned everything out, we can move on to fitting. Sounds pretty good. Looks like I have just a tiny bit of gap in two, maybe 3 places where I must have gotten a little overzealous with the cleaning, but otherwise, it's pretty good.